Have you ever been driving down the road and seen a long train of a bunch of little kids? And at one end you see a teacher, an adult, leading the pack. And sometimes at the end, usually at the end, there's an adult as well. What's going on there? Well, what you've got is you have a preschool, you have a daycare, a Head Start program, something like that. And they're all going out to maybe to the library, or they're going to some adventure, right? They're going to some place. Why are they all in a line like that? Why are they all following the teacher in front? Well, obviously the teacher knows where they're going. They're trying to get to a certain destination, and there's security there. Now, what happens if every child decides that they're going to go and do their own thing, that they're not going to follow, and they're going to run all over the place? Well, they're not going to get to where they need to go, right? They don't know how to get there. They also might get lost or hurt. That's a good possibility as well, right? Chaos ensues. If they follow that teacher, and in fact, most of the time they're holding hands, and the child in front is holding the teacher's hand. If they hold to the teacher, they're going to get where they're going. There's security there. There's safety there. And again, they're going to get to their destination. You know, we as Christians, we have to follow God. We have to hold to God's unchanging hand. Now somebody asks, well, how do we do that? How do we hold to God's hand? How do we follow God? He's not physically here. He's not visible to us. How do we do that? Well, one of the ways that we do that is through obedience. That we are called to live obedient lives, and in doing that, we're following God. We're holding to God's unchanging hand. That's important. And when we do that, there's a couple things that happen. First of all, we need to do that regardless of what the culture says, whatever tradition says. If God says to do something and culture says not to, or says to do something in opposition to what God has said, we follow God. We follow God. Regardless of social pressures, we follow God. And when we do that, we find that there's a freedom in following God. There's a freedom that happens when we are holding to God, when we're obedient. And there's also a joy. We have a joy that we receive, that we experience when we hold to God, when we are obedient to God. This morning we're going to look at Luke. We're going to be looking at Luke chapter 1, verses 57 through 80. Well, we'll be looking at 57 through 66 really, but 57 through 80 is the text that was read. And this is the account of a man named Zechariah. You remember Zechariah and his wife Elizabeth. They're well advanced in years. They are past the age of having children, and they haven't had any children up to this point. But God steps in, and God says, you're going to have a child. And one of the proofs that he gives Zechariah is he makes him unable to speak for the whole period of time. It's actually more than that. It's not just that he can't speak. He can't speak and he can't hear either. He's in silence for 9 months. And that is this sign of what God is going to do. But let's take a look and read the text here. So I want to look at Luke chapter 1. I want to read 57 through 66. And it says this. It says, "Now the time came for Elizabeth to give birth, and she bore a son. And her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown great mercy to her, and they rejoiced with her. And on the 8th day, they came to circumcise the child. And they would have called him Zechariah after his father. But his mother answered, 'No, he shall be called John.' And they said to her, 'None of your relatives is called by this name.' And they made signs to his father, inquiring what he wanted him to be called. And he asked for a writing tablet and wrote, 'His name is John.' And they all wondered. And immediately his mouth was opened, and his tongue loosed, and he spoke, blessing God. And fear came on all their neighbors. And all these things were talked about through all the hill country of Judea. And all who heard them laid them up in their hearts, saying, 'What then will this child be?' For the hand of the Lord was with him." When Zechariah's child is born, they wait 8 days and they circumcise him. Now that was in accordance to the will of God. God had revealed that male children were to be circumcised on the 8th day. And so they're following that. That was not only God's command, it was a custom of the day, but it was a command of God. So they're following God's will there on that situation. And they're going to name the child at that time as well. So they're going to have him circumcised, and then they're going to name him. And when they do that, when they get ready, the friends and the relatives, they put forward that this child should be named Zechariah after his father, right? Named after his father. That was the culture of the day. That was the norm of the day. That you named the child either after the father or a relative or something like that. And they present that to Elizabeth, and Elizabeth says, "No. His name's not going to be Zechariah. His name is John. He's going to be called John." Now, they're a bit perplexed, again, because this is not the norm. This is not the social norm. This is not the custom and the tradition of the day. So they think maybe she's lost her mind a little. They ask Zechariah, they ask the father. Now, remember, Zechariah can't hear. So he doesn't know what Elizabeth has said. He couldn't hear it. And they make signs to him and say, what do you want to call him? He asks for a writing tablet, and he writes down his name is John. They have both lost their mind. They've both lost their mind, right? Nobody in your family's name is John. Completely countercultural. Completely counter to what was the norm of Zechariah's day. Why did he name him John? He's obeying God. He's obeying God. Regardless of what people around him, regardless of what the culture around said, Zechariah is faithful. He's following God. He's obeying what God had called him to do. Now could Zechariah, could he have made excuses? Could he have caved into the social pressures and named his son Zechariah or some other relative's name, close relative's name? He could have. He could have. See, Zechariah is still has free will. He still has choice, right? He could have done that. In fact, we look throughout the scriptures and we find that God's people quite often will rebel against what God has said, rebel against God's commands. Think about in the garden, you've got Adam and Eve. God gives them one command: don't eat of this one specific tree. And what do? They rebel. They eat again. They eat of that tree. And you see this again throughout Israel's history. There are times when God's people refuse. to obey God. Zechariah doesn't. He doesn't care what the pressures of the day are. He's going to follow God. Christian, that's what we're called to as well. We are called to obey God rather than men. We are called to obey God. We are called to follow God regardless of what our culture says, regardless of what the norms of our society are. If they are in opposition to what God says, we follow God. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, I read an article. It was about two lesbian women who wanted to have a child. And so they recruited a third party, a gay man. Well, there was some things that happened, and a judge eventually ruled that all three were the legal parents of that child. Strange, wrong, confusing. That's not right. That's not right. And this kind of thing is more and more acceptable. This is the social norm. We might say abnormal is the social norm. Now, that kind of thing is wrong. Not because I say it's wrong. Not because somebody else says it's wrong. It's wrong because God says it's wrong. It doesn't matter what the culture around us believes, thinks. Doesn't matter what the pressure is. We need to stand for truth. And again, this is just one issue, right? It's not even the only issue. It's not even the most important issue. There are lots of different issues out there. There's a lot of things out there that the culture says that we should do or should accept, that God says no, and vice versa. It doesn't matter what the culture says. We're called to obey God, regardless of what the culture says. It doesn't matter. We are called to be obedient, just like Zechariah was obedient. And when we are obedient, when we call sin, sin, and listen, we're not talking about being jerks. We're not talking about being hateful and aggressive towards people and beating people up with the truth. But that's not what we're talking about. We're just talking about being faithful. We're talking about standing up, and when the pressures around us say, you should accept this, you should say that this is good, and it's something God has said is sinful, we say, no, it's sinful. We stand with God on those issues. And when we do, when we obey God, when we stay connected to God, when we're obedient to Him, it's freeing. A lot of times people think that obeying God is restrictive, it's oppressive. God doesn't want you to have any fun or anything like that. It's actually the opposite. It's very freeing when we are in the will of God, when we are in fellowship and communion, when we are in obedience, in obedient fellowship with God. It's freeing. Think again back to the garden, to Adam and Eve. They were free before sin entered the picture, before they rebelled against God. They were free to eat of any tree in the garden except for one. They were free to enjoy fellowship with the Creator of the universe. They were free as they experienced their loving relationship one with another. There was freedom there. There was blessing there. There was joy there. What happens when sin enters the picture? Well, when sin enters the picture, that's when things become restrictive. That's when someone becomes a slave. Sin. Obedience. Obedience brings freedom. Freedom. In fact, Zechariah experienced that as well, didn't he? As he was obedient and he named his son John, his tongue was loosed. And what did he do? He experienced joy. And it came out in joyful praise of God. He blesses God, his Redeemer. Joyful praise. obedience to God's will brings about joy. Remember that King David, there was a period of time in David's life when Israel's doing well. King David is following God in obedience, and the ark is being brought back into Israel. And David, in joyful expression, is dancing and leaping before the ark, and he's praising God, he's singing to God. Moses and the Israelites, when they are freed from Egyptian slavery and they come through the Red Sea, in obedience, they needed to be obedient. And it was difficult to be obedient to God, to leave Egypt under threat. It was definitely threatened. Pharaoh follows them. But on the other side of the Red Sea, there is joy that comes out in song. They sing praises to God. Obedience to God brings about joy. Now, joy is different than happiness. Happiness has to do with what's happening. And sometimes what's happening is great. And the joy bubbles up inside of us, and we express that in songs and things of that nature. But sometimes things are not going well, and yet we can still have joy, because joy is that inner aspect of knowing who we are in Jesus, knowing who Jesus is, knowing the God of the universe, and knowing that he'll never leave us or forsake us. That brings about joy. Obedience brings about that joy, and that joy often overflows in joyful expressions of song and things of that nature, in good times and in bad. Think about this. Jeremiah sings praises to God in the book of Lamentations. I want to read part of Lamentation chapter 3. I'm not going to read the whole thing, although I would encourage you to read that this week. Go and read chapter 3 of Lamentation and see what the prophet experienced. But in chapter 3, he says this. He says, I am the man who has seen affliction under the rod of his wrath. He has driven and brought me into darkness without any light. Speaking about God. This is how he feels. He feels as if God is doing this. Verse 14, he says, I have become a laughingstock of all the people, the object of their taunts all day long. People were ridiculing him. People were mocking him. You ever been ridiculed or mocked? You ever feel like life is dark? Verses 17 through 27, my soul is bereft of peace. That is, I don't even know what peace is. He says, I've forgotten what happiness is. So I say, my endurance has perished. So has my hope from the Lord. Remember my affliction and my wanderings, the wormwood and the gall. My soul continually remembers it and is bowed down within me. Jeremiah says, my world is crashing down. Things are dark. I feel like God has locked me in a dark room and I can't see. I feel like I don't even know what peace is anymore. I don't know what happiness is anymore. You ever been there? You ever feel like that? And maybe you're experiencing it now. I mean, the world around us today we're living through a pretty dark period of time in history. Others have lived through dark periods of time, and we're living through a dark period of time now. Sicknesses. The loss of family and friends. Have you lost someone recently? Does it feel dark? Are people sick who you love and care for? Are you sick? Are you experiencing darkness even in the midst of darkness, even in the midst of when it feels as if the world is caving in on us, we can still have joy in the midst of all that. Listen to what Jeremiah says. He says, this is how I feel. We don't live on feelings. We have them. We do. We have them. We have good feelings and bad feelings. And they're God-given. But we don't base our lives on feelings. Jeremiah says, this is how I feel. I feel like God has abandoned me. I feel like I'm living in darkness. But he says this, and the world is crashing down. But he says, you know what? I remember truth. He's going to remember truth. See, truth trumps feelings. Doesn't make them go away. Doesn't make the feelings go away. But truth trumps feelings. He says this. He says this, but this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. He's going to remember truth. He says, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul who seeks him. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. You know, those verses, those words are part of a hymn we sing. They come pretty much word for word straight out of the Bible, straight out of Lamentation chapter 3. And I don't know about you, but every time I sing that song, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. When I sing that, I always think it's a very peppy, uplifting, upbeat song. It comes from a very dark place. Jeremiah was not happy, but he was able to have joy based on truth, based on the reality of who God really is and his relationship with the God of the universe. The same is true for us, even when it looks bad. Obedience to God brings joyful praise. See, you and I are called to obey God, and when we're obedient, we find freedom and we find joy, whether things are good around us or bad. Zechariah obeyed God, even though to do so was to go against the cultural norms of his day, the traditions. And we're called to obedience no matter what the culture of our day says. We need to take hold of God's hand. We need to follow as he leads. Time is filled with swift transition. Not of earth unmoved can stand. Build your hopes on things eternal. Hold to God's unchanging hand. God bless you.